Well, hello there. So today we're going to work on a painting project. We're going to paint using wet in wet technique and also some texture techniques like added salt, and we're going to use a limited colour palette to make a painting, quite a simple painting of these figs. So I'm working from a photograph and I'm using an HB pencil and just making a light underdrawing to guide my painting. When we're doing an underdrawing for watercolour, it's important not to use too much pencil, not to leave too many marks that you don't want to keep in the final painting, because once you've painted over them you can't remove them. So I'm just adding a little bit of an indication of where everything is going to fit on my paper. And here I am selecting my limited colour palette, and for this painting I'm just going to use a triad, that's 3 colours of ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson and lemon yellow. And through this triad we're going to use colour mixing to achieve those lovely bruised purples, a sort of limey olivey greens and some shadow colours, all from that limited colour palette. And the reason that I use a limited colour palette is that it produces a really harmonious painting. It's really useful if you haven't done much colour mixing and you're not very confident mixing colours, to use this kind of exercise to really practice, to change the proportions of your pigments and get an idea for how much of each to add in order to get the colour that you want. And there's a surprising variety just from 3 pigments. So I start here by mixing green. It's not fully mixed, it's a sort of olivey green, slightly desaturated green from my yellow and my blue, and I add a bit of the red in there too to desaturate. And then as we go, we're adding in some variety into the painting here with some of those purples. Some of the purple has more blue in it, some has more red in it. It's slightly desaturated purple, so we have some of the yellow in there too, so that's red, blue and just a touch of the yellow to desaturate it, to bring it closer to brown or grey, and that gives us really natural finish for these natural figs. If I was using palette purple, so a ready-made purple, I wouldn't get the same natural results. And then I add just a sprinkle of sea salt while the paint is wet. And we'll see as the painting develops what that does to that damp paint. So I'm going to move on to a different fig here, the one in the background, while the other dries. And it's useful when you're painting something like this little still life to treat each fig separately so that you can move between them and allow each little bit of painting to dry. So while the first fig is drying, I can be working on this second fig. And this is in the background of the painting, so I've actually gone for a slightly more blue purple. I've got my photo, my reference photo there. You can see this little fig in the background, and you can see this ultramarine blue in this mixed sort of purple violet colour is granulating out really beautifully. So I'm using a size 12 brush, and it has this lovely belly in the brush, bristles that carry lots of paint. So I'm able to paint this fig and keep the whole of the fig shape damp enough to keep on working and adding colour into as I go. So you can see I can then make really soft gradations with my colour, and this paint is still damp as I add in darker purple to add in some shadows, to add in a little bit of variation. So we're working damp into damp to charge that colour in there, to add that variety so that it's not flat. And now I'm moving on to some more of the yellowy green, this olivey green colour. Now with the blue and the yellow that I have selected, the lemon yellow and the ultramarine, you only get a limited range of greens, so it isn't quite as zingy as it might be. But I don't mind that. That's a compromise I'm willing to make because I just want to use this limited colour palette today. So here I'm adding a little more of the pink here, so lovely alizarin crimson. It has a touch of the blue in it and a touch of the yellow, and it's producing these wonderful rosy russet colours. And as I work across this fig, I'm just adding in little drops here and there to make the sort of variation, the natural pattern on the fig. Working wet in wet like this is really good for natural subjects because you do then get a huge variety of hues, that is colour mixed from our palette, and that variety really mimics what we find in nature. So it's important when you're adding or dropping in like this to wet paint to make sure that the colour that you're dropping in is slightly thicker. If you add lots of wet paint at this point, you will make blooms, you'll introduce too much liquid onto the surface and it will move and push the existing paint layer. So I'm putting slightly thicker paint as I drop in damp into damp to stop that from happening. And then we're going to add some more salt. So you can see in my palette, I've got nice mixing area there, largish mixing area, nice and flat, so that I can make up largish areas of colour. And I can see what I'm making on the palette. So I'm moving on to this fig number 4. I'm adding some of that beautiful, strong purple, and I keep the area workable. Again, I'm using this size 12 brush, but if you find that an awful lot of paint floods out when you're using your brush and you find it difficult to control, you could size down. The issue there is that you won't then apply enough paint. Quite often when I'm teaching, one of the struggles I see is with not enough paint applied. So rather dry paint, lots of overpainting, and some sort of slightly unsatisfactory overworked washes, things like that. And that's usually a problem with the size of the brush and the amount of paint that's being applied. So here I'm adding in some of the detail for this fig, and while the paint is damp, I'm then going to lift some areas out too. So we've got this really soft areas of paler value, that is a lighter area, as I blot my brush, my clean damp brush, on a piece of kitchen towel, just to lift away some of those areas quite carefully. It's almost like drawing back in, removing the areas of light on the fig so we can find some highlights back into that form. And then actually the paint is still damp enough for me to then drop in and add in some more shade around the edges. So the good thing about working on something like these figs, these sort of smallish objects, is that I can then work the whole fig without it drying out, without worrying that it's too much for me to manage all at once. It's quite a small area, which means I can manage to get quite a lot of work done in this initial painting, so that I won't have to do very much painting over the top. Moving on now to this fifth fig, the one in the foreground, and it's useful to paint in that way, to paint towards the foreground with watercolour, because apart from anything else you're not then going to be leaning on areas you've already painted. But in the foreground we're going to look to have a bit more texture, the most texture in the painting, and also the most contrast, because this helps with a sense of distance. So you can see the figs at the back are a bit more subdued and flatter, and this fig in the foreground, that is the front of the painting, I'm going to make sure that I make it more interesting, so it has more texture and more saturation, so stronger colours, and more contrast, so that's light and dark next to each other, and that will really help with a sense of distance. So here I'm adding some quite damp colour, and all the time I'm working into damp edges. So if your paint is drying out too quickly and you don't achieve this softened edge, then perhaps think about loading up a bigger brush with a little bit more paint to keep it working for longer. You could of course also dampen the whole fig with water before you add colour. But if we do that, then we're in danger of losing control of the paint, and also where there are white edges. So here I have a little white highlight that I've reserved just on the front of the fig there, to help us with a sense of 3 dimensions and volume. And once I start adding in some of the darker areas, you can see this sense of volume suddenly start to appear. So to understand volume or form in our painting, we need a full tonal value range. So if you find that something that you're painting that's supposed to be round doesn't look particularly round, it may well be that you just don't have enough of the full tonal value range. That is, from the lightest area all the way down to the darkest. Now, watercolour dries paler, so it's quite common for beginners in watercolour to find their paintings are a little bit on the pale side, and that stops them from having this sense of roundness, of form and of depth. So I'm using a bit of dry brush here just to add a bit of texture onto that area of highlight. And the dry brush is really just pushing the paint across the surface so that it skates just across the surface of the paper, and so that it doesn't fill in those dimples within the cold pressed paper, but just skates across the top, and that gives us that sparkle of the dry brush effect. So as I continue to add a bit of depth, add a bit of contour around the edges here, again dropping in with some stronger colour because we're working damp into damp and we don't want to add a lot of extra water onto the page at this point. You can see in other areas of the painting that the salt has taken effect on those wet areas that we dropped the salt on to add texture. You can see those sort of sparkles and star shapes. So I'm going to do that again here in the foreground, and it must be done while the paint is wet because the paint has to still be able to move across the surface of the paper to get that effect. So now we have dry paint. You can see what that salt has done, those little star and speckle shapes on each of those figs, giving me some texture that I couldn't possibly have painted. And we're going to go in now and add in some shadows. So I'm painting these shadows, again wet in wet, so I've added an area of clean water where the shadow is going to lie, and I'm going to make a neutral, a grey, from our triad. I haven't added anything else, so I'm still using our Alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue and lemon yellow to make this neutral grey, which is a slightly lilac-y grey, which is a really good shadow colour. It's a really useful one to have in your palette. And you just need to play with your colour mixing to get the proportions how you want them. So for a grey, you'll need slightly more blue, just a touch of the yellow, and a medium amount of the red, and it will depend a bit on your pigments and how strong they are, but that should give you something approaching a grey. And if you change the proportions, so if you had more red and more yellow but only a bit of blue, then you get something much more akin to a warm brown. And I'm going to work across the rest of the painting, adding in some shadows underneath each of these figs. You can see in the photograph that the shadows aren't a dead grey. They do have warmth, they do have a bit of reflected colour from the figs and from the light source in the room. So they aren't a very dull grey, they're actually quite warm and quite interesting grey. And it's useful to make your shadow colour always from the colours that are in your object or your scene, rather than using something completely different to produce shadows. Because the colour of light in the shadows will be reflected from the objects around it. So here I'm just deepening some of these shadows. Just like the figs, I'm dropping in some stronger colour just while the initial wash is still damp to deepen those areas. And then I'm going to go in and just have a look at everything that might need a little bit of finishing touches and adding some detail. So spared up the painting here a little bit, but you can see all I'm really doing is just the odd detail and tidying up the odd edge around the painting. I'm just adding some dry brush effect just to add to the texture on the fig in the foreground, and a little bit of tidying edges. And there we are. So you can see our foreground texture, the salt and the dry brush. And the beautiful combination of our limited colour palette. So, time to try it for yourself.